Now it's time to begin with the panel discussion, and our moderator is Professor Mariko. And the panel members are Professor Felix Wilfred, Professor Herman Toiler, Professor Georg Evers, Professor Sebastian Perus. I invite them all to the podium now. Professor Felix Wilfred, Professor Herman Toiler, Professor George Evers, Professor Sebastian Perus. Now the moderator takes over.
Good morning, everyone. Can I be heard? Thank you for being here this morning so early. Yesterday we saw two ways of being moderator. And don't worry, I'm not going to add a third way. But we look forward to listening to our distinguished panel of speakers. Upon instructions, we start with Dr. Herman Toiler, who will talk about West Asia, Christianity in West Asia. And then we move to Central Asia. We will listen to Dr. Perus afterwards. And then move on to South Asia to listen to Father Felix. And then to Dr. Evers for Southeast Asia. Dr. Toiler, please.
Well, I would first like to thank Professor Felix Wilfred for inviting me to come to Chennai. It's about 1 year and a half that I received the invitation to contribute to the volume of Christianity in Asia, which of course I was very happy to accept. But I must tell you that after accepting this invitation, I received a second email, and I was a little bit puzzled. For in that email, Professor Wilfred said, well, you're not going to talk about Middle Eastern Christianity, but you have rather to speak of West Asian Christianity. And I'm really puzzled about that. And my hesitations were not taken away when I was listening to our discussions yesterday. And let me tell you why. First, there is a geographical reason. In a certain way, the Middle East is not linked to Asia. It is a category of its own. One of the reasons is that the Middle East is certainly not limited to Asia. You also have to include at least Egypt and maybe also the Christians from Ethiopia. You cannot understand Christianity in the Middle East if you do not also take into account the great contribution of the Coptic Christians. They belong to the Middle East, but of course they have no place in a handbook of Asian Christianity. I'm of course very much aware of the fact of the interaction of Middle Eastern Christianity to the Malabar and the Syro-Malankara Christians in the state of Kerala, and of the missionary activities of the Nestorian Church to Central Asia and even as far as China. So in this way, there is an interflow between the Middle East and the rest of Asia, but still the Middle East remains a category of its own. The second reason for my hesitation is the dwindling numbers of Christians in the Middle East compared to what I feel are the vibrant communities of Christians in other parts of Asia. For the Middle East, what is very much needed is that we have to set up a desk or a research project or whatever you would like to call it, where you can study the reasons for these dwindling numbers, the causes why Christians leave the Middle East. Political reasons, economic reasons, and certainly not only religious reasons. The third reason for my hesitations is the religious context. In the Middle East, we are speaking of Christianity living in an Islamic, in a Muslim world. Well, then you could argue, you may compare it to the situation in Pakistan or Malaysia or Indonesia. But no, that's not a good comparison in the sense that in the Middle East, Well, we talked already about it also a little bit yesterday, that in the Middle East, Christianity is autochthonous. It was there before Islam, and I feel you can even not understand the beginnings of Islam and also the later development in the Islamic world if you also do not take into account the contributions of these Miaphysite or Nestorian Christians. So that makes it really different from Pakistan, Indonesia, in the Middle East. There is no import Christianity. It's not the Christianity from the West, but it is really Eastern. Let me reflect a little bit more on this, on the autochthonous character of the Christians in the Middle East. In the general history of Christianity, what you can read in the majority of the handbooks is, well, Christianity, it started in Palestine, and so forth and so on. Jesus and the apostle expressed themselves in Aramaic, but very soon that early message had to be translated into the Greek language, had to be also adapted to the philosophical categories that were attractive to the Hellenistic world. But the situation in the Middle East was quite different. Christianity also spread to cities like Edessa, Urhoy now in eastern Turkey, spread to Mesopotamia. But there, that translation movement into the Greek language was not necessary. Christianity there could remain Semitic. It was expressed in almost the very same language spoken by Jesus and the apostles, the disciples, the Syriac language. And that really makes a big difference and makes Christianity in the Middle East very attractive. To explain this, I always discuss with my students a creed published in the 4th century, written in the 4th century by a certain Afrahat, surnamed the Persian sage, a creed that was composed almost at the in the very same years when the Hellenistic, the Greek-speaking world, composed the Creed of Nicaea, Constantinople. Well, that Syriac creed is biblical. Jesus is situated in the line of the Old Testament prophets. There is no speaking of being consubstantial with the Father. It's a very difficult philosophical concept. No philosophy in that creed. And what is more important, the end of the creed says, this is the face of our church. We have to be chaste. We have not to be jealous, meaning that also our faith has to be put into practice, and that also belongs to the creed of these Semitic Christians. In a later period, when Islam grew stronger, well, Christians in the Middle East, of course, became Arabicized, were also happy to adopt the Arab language. It was the beginning of the creation of a Christian Arabic theology, which is not so far very well studied. And what makes Christianity in that region for me very interesting is that the creation of this Christian Arab theology created a kind of a common ground, offered the possibilities of really entering into what I do not hesitate to call a genuine dialogue with Islam. I would like to give you an example. In the 9th century, there was an encounter between a Christian monk and the Islamic governor of Jerusalem. And both men talked about, well, when two persons belonging to different religions talk about religions, how do you have to do that? And then the Islamic governor formulates a wonderful phrase. What we have to do is to empty our hearts, to get rid of our prefixed, pre-established categories of thinking of our prejudices. So really, this period in the first Abbasid period was really a great time of dialogue between the members of the two religions. Somewhat later, there is a reverse movement. Now Christians also started to accept categories of thinking from the Islamic world. And let me again explain it just with one example. In the 13th century, you have a Christian thinker whose name was Bar Ibrahim. Well, when he was a spiritual author, and when he was reflecting and writing on prayer, on fasting, how to explain it to his flock, to his people, well, he thought the best way to do it is to open a wonderful Islamic book, Ihya Ulumuddin, the Revival of Religious Sciences, written by Al-Ghazali, and he explained prayer, and he explained fasting, and he explained other spiritual concepts in the words of this Islamic thinker. So there was a commonality, there was a common ground between the world of Islam and the Christians of that region. And now when I jump to the 19th century, well, that was a period when the Christians and the Muslims worked together, struggled together in the movement of Arab nationalism, creating a common Arab identity, and then it did not matter whether you were a Christian or a Muslim. And that gave the Christians the basis of occupying a wonderful position in the Arab states that were created after the First World War. So I feel Christianity in the Middle East is really an interesting subject, and in this respect I'm also very happy, of course, that it has its place in this handbook of Asian Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toile. An exciting introduction to Christianity, when it all started. Dr. Perus, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Well, before starting, I would like to thank Professor Felix Wilfred, who gave me this wonderful opportunity to publish a contribution in this volume and to meet today, to come here and to meet today with all of you. So thank you very much. I myself, a researcher working on Central Asia, which remains quite, unknown region for many people, and when I'm talking about Central Asia, I'm thinking about 5 countries, which are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, so which were all part of the former Soviet Union and which became independent after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, and they officially became independent then. What I would like to do today, so of course, my contribution was really focusing on the situation of Christians, movements, Christian denominations in Central Asia, but what I would like to do maybe today is to focus on one of the topics I addressed in this contribution, which is the inter-religious dialogue in Central Asia. But maybe before coming to that, let me very briefly explain the historical context in which religions in Central Asia are now. Well, you all know, of course, that religions in during the Soviet regime were quite repressed. They were in a very difficult situation with, of course, different periods with, for example, under Stalin. I mean, they were extremely repressed under Stalin, especially in the 20s and 30s. Then the situation got a little bit better during the Second World War, and after, then you had a new anti-religious campaign under Khrushchev. The situation became again a little bit better under Brezhnev, but generally speaking, the situation of religions in the Soviet Union and in Soviet Central Asia was really difficult. So what happened after independence is that there were new laws were passed, new constitutions were passed, which gave all religions in Central Asia real freedom with the possibility to practice any religion without fearing any kind of administrative issues, any kind of political issues, at least officially, the possibility to get an education in Islam or in Christianity, the possibility to publish literature, to import literature from different countries. So, in this context, of course, there was a kind of religious revival throughout Central Asia, with first, of course, a revival of Islam. You know that there's 5 post-Soviet countries have a majority of Muslim population, at least 90%, except maybe in Kazakhstan, which has quite a lot of European minorities still today, like a lot of Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Poles, but still even in Kazakhstan you have at least 80% of Muslims. But besides, Muslims, you have a lot of Christian movements. The first one is the Russian Orthodox Church, because there are an important Russian minority in these countries, especially again in Kazakhstan, but also in the other republics. And you have also, we saw the development of many other Christian denominations, especially, a little bit the Catholic Church, but especially many Protestant denominations, so the Lutheran Church, but also other Protestant movements like Baptist, Seventh-day Adventist, or Pentecostalist, etc. So, and what we saw after independence, especially in the 1990s, is that there was an attempt for each religion to try not to get to know each other, because all these movements were already present actually under the Soviet regime, and even before the Soviet regime, under the Tsarist regime. But there were in the 1990s some meetings just to talk about how to face this new situation in this context of freedom of religion. But these meetings have become more and more rare. And finally, what we saw is that the only meetings we had we could see in the 2000s were meetings which were organized by the political authorities, like, for example, the one we have regularly today in Kazakhstan, which is the World Congress of Religion, but which actually gathers, several religions, like, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, Jews, or Buddhists. Buddhists and, for example, Jews have are very limited in Central Asia. For example, Buddhists represent something like 0.2%, I guess, in Central Asia, whereas other Protestant movements like Baptist and the Seventh-day Adventist or whatever, which are much more important in terms of believers in Central Asia, are not invited. So, the interconfessional dialogue has been very limited in the 2000s. And what we actually saw in Central Asia is that the interreligious dialogue is done between the Russian Orthodox Church now and Muslim representatives, and which has been mainly focused on actually how to limit the right of other denominations, of other, especially of Christian denominations. Why? Because this dialogue has been more a kind of reaction against the growing influence of other Christian movements, against their growing the growing number of conversion. What we saw in the 1990s in all the republics is that there were more and more Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, Turkmens converted to Christianity, and more Russians going to Protestant movements. So you had first a quite strong reaction of Muslims. The rapid development of foreign Christian missions and the resulting conversions of members of the titular nationalities really, yes, provoked a strong reaction from the hierarchy among Muslim representatives. And according to what Muslims representatives say in Central Asia, each Central Asian state must retain a strict distinction between, on the one hand, titular population and Islam, and on the other hand, European minorities and orthodoxies. And so again, you had a strong reaction of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was considering that the fact that Russians were more and more converted to a Protestant movement were a kind of, well, they could not accept that. The Russian Orthodox Church, considering that it was the first Christian church on Central Asian territory, coming with the colonization started by Russians in Kazakhstan in the end of the 18th century, in the Kazakhstan steppes, then in the 19th century. To what actually other Christian movements replied that actually there were a lot of other minorities, European minorities, coming in the 18th and 19th century, like, for example, Germans and Poles. So they arrived at the same time. So what this led to a kind of alliance between Muslims and Orthodox to put pressure on the political authorities to change the law, saying that these movements were a kind of threat to the political stability in Central Asia, to the unity of religion, to unity of Christian movements. And this had quite strong consequences because the laws were changed in Turkmenistan and in Uzbekistan, not only because of that, I mean, we can talk about that later, but not only because of that, but the fact that Christian movements and Muslims have put pressure on the government really motivated the governments to change the laws, and the freedom of religions became very quickly extremely limited in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan in the 1990s, and today there were new laws, there are more and more laws passed on religion in the three other republics, and especially in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, which strongly restrict the freedom of religion. So I insist on that because and I will stop here, but just to say that even if we talk about real religious diversity in Central Asia, which is still true, partly true in some of these republics, there is a growing concern, which is mentioned in most of reports published on freedom of religions, on of human rights. The situation of religions is becoming more and more difficult. It is unfortunately a disaster in Turkmenistan. I mean, it has been the case since the 1990s. It is extremely difficult in Uzbekistan, but even in the other republics like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, it's also becoming more and more difficult. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Update on the Central Asian Christianity and situation. We will now hear from Father Felix.
There is a proverb in the Malayalam language which says, you must stop singing when the voice is still good. I tell this to people who find it very difficult to retire. And in this context I say, because I would like to stop before Mariko stops me. I would like to keep to that time. How could you present the whole South Asian Christianity and discussion? It's not going to be a kind of historical overview which you can easily find, but something like a snapshots, some of the issues connected with what we have been discussing in the last day. Some of the themes will be, converging. So I thought of 6 concepts and the debates around these concepts, One is the issue of identity, about which we spoke yesterday a lot. The issue of culture, caste, nationalism, minority, and modernity. These are the 6 concepts around which there are so many debates and questions in South Asia, Christianity. Let me come to the question of identity. The formation of the identity does not come about simply, in the framework of a liberal view where an individual has a freedom and therefore I freely choose to be something else. It's always bound up with a community. Therefore, you, and especially a society which is organized against the caste, on the basis, matrix of caste, it means moving from, the caste identity is destabilized. So, a conversion or moving from one religion to another. So the identity is questioned, So not simply that I move from one to the other, simply as a choice, You are situated in a caste society, therefore this whole destabilization happens. And actually in the 19th century, there are so many court cases against parents going against the children who are converted, going to the court and saying that, this should not happen, etc., etc. So the identity formation had many socio-political, cultural components. One of the components which tried to help the identity formation of the South Asian Christians, especially in India, is that the people who converted did not have a locus standi legally. Who are they? Because they did not come under the, Hindu law. Therefore, the question of, inheritance, the guardianship of children, property rights, all those became, because they said you don't, because you change, you are out of the caste system, therefore you don't have the right to property, etc. Therefore, in 1850, a law was enacted, which is called Lex Loci, that means Caste Disabilities Removal Act, by which the converts are protected. Therefore, a legal identity was given by making Christians part of the British law. Therefore, again, a very clear indication from the legal perspective of the alienation of the Christian. They do not come under the local law and the law system. So they are ruled by the British law. Therefore, again, the alienation of Christians. So you could discuss this aspect of, the alienation from the roots and caste. And the identity question also can be approached from another angle, in the sense that Christianity, there is a question of identity of Christianity, but also Christianity was a conferrer of identity, especially when it came to the disprivileged and the marginal people like the tribals and the Dalits. For example, one way under the British rule was that, the Dalit people who were, so-called untouchables, they did not have an identity of their own because casteless, was to join the British army. This gives a little bit of self-respect. I am an army man. Therefore, you must imagine something like that sociologically, that when they joined Christianity, it gave an identity. I am somebody. And the prestige of belonging to the rulers, the British, it gave a dignity of their rule. So therefore, it's not only a question of how do you make Christianity local or something, that's one problematic, but it was also a question of conferrer of identity. And therefore, the question of tribals and Dalits' attitude towards Christianity is very different from the issue of inculturation, embeddedness and all that, that way. So I'm just opening up a whole discussion which is debates around that. Coming to the second concept is that of a culture. Culture is a much larger issue, Of course, there was a whole Darwinism, cultural Darwinism, evolutionism, which is very bad, which was promoted by the colonial rulers, because as Karl Marx said, the ruling ideas of a period are the ideas of the ruling class. Therefore, there's whole evolutionary perspective from the primitivism, slowly culture exactly evolved the full culture, what the Hegel tried to present, the whole evolution of the human history. So it is anthropologists who contributed a plurality of cultures, each one to be respected with incommensurability. You cannot measure each culture. Each culture is unique and different. Therefore, I think a great contribution, we discussed about how secular sciences contribute to the understanding of Christianity itself or religion itself. Here's a case where it contributed to plurality of cultures, and as a matter of fact, and therefore not only simply contemplative pluralism of it is this, but also an interactive pluralism which challenges of how do you relate to the difference, which is a very big European question today, you know, especially with the religions they are coming, you know. So, so in that sense, you know, culture. But what happened was that, especially Roman Catholic Church, you have the Vatican Council, which had whole thing in church in the modern world, where you have a whole chapter on the culture, you know, number 53, 62, etc., dealing with it, which brings out this broad, beautiful humanity, the diversity, all that plurality, beautiful. But the tragedy is, as I say, that it applied this great cultural concept, which is human, only to the church and institution. We want to be inculturated. It's much larger issue. Children are much larger issue than how do you teach them catechism. I can reduce. The issue of child, you know, is much larger. You have to have a theology of creation, God's creation, humanity, such a larger perspective. So you can't reduce it to simply how to transmit faith to them, you know. Church is very much reduced to that. Culture is much a larger issue, and I think this is one of the questions which you need to face, and not resize that, to use a typical American expression, resize it to within the church, you know. So that is one major question regarding this concept of culture. Then there is the whole question of ambiguity regarding that, which is a characteristic of South Asian Christianity. You can say the Christianity is embedded, but you can also say alien. Both are true. Both are true. This is the ambiguity, you know. So if you go to the village Christianity in Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu, it is very much like the Hindu. You have the 10 days festival, all their procession. I have read in the L'Abbé Dubois, you know, this famous book of Indian customs and manners, how he narrates about the processions and the quarrels they had. Typical, the same thing which we find also in the churches, etc., etc. So there is a whole aspect of embeddedness that, but there is also a whole of alienation, you know, in the sense of, you know, in the way of thinking, and then, you know, and especially in relation to yesterday's talk, the relationship to the other religions, which is alienated, you know, which is alienated. The hurt feelings, the memories of, it doesn't go, you cannot sweep it under the carpet, it remains. Therefore, you just cannot wish away colonialism, it is there. And therefore, it has caused tremendous psychic, how do you call, aggression, let's say. You know, when I want to refer here, when the Pope, I think John Paul came second to Delhi, there was a big debate on the conversion, you know, there was, and that's the time when the Prime Minister of India said we must have a national debate on conversion, etc., etc. But subsided. But when the Pope left, the next day the paper, the first news is Pope leaves behind a debate. Because he said, well, the first century millennium was of that Asia, West Asia, and the second millennium was that of America, etc., etc. Third millennium, we look forward to a big harvest in Asia. Of course, everybody understood what he means. And therefore, that led to Arun Shah to write a book called The Harvesting of Our Souls. You know, so there is a whole ambiguity regarding, you know, the embeddedness on the one side, but also alienation. And this is it's another, if you expand it to other East Asia, etc., China, etc., rooted, but at the same time you have to conform to what the state machinery says, etc., etc. In that case, it's most ideological and you know, a centralized state. But similarly, also you have that how are you going to act as a Christian? Is it only conform? Does it a set of practices, or does it also challenge to speak, you know, more in a Christian term, a prophetic? So how do you combine the embeddedness with the prophetic? If you become embedded, that means you are conformed to. Is that the critique of what's happening around, and on what basis? Therefore, the need to be rooted, to be prophetic, which came out very clearly in the question of Bishop Azaria, you know, of Dornakal, you know that. He was considered to be enemy number one of Gandhi, because of him he could not say you are alien Christian. He was in the dusty soil of Andhra Pradesh going around like him. So Gandhi was embarrassed. No, he expected a Christian to be very alienated. Here is a Bishop Azaria who was in the dusty soil of Andhra villages. No. So it's the whole problematic of embeddedness and the prophetism with which South Asian Christianity is done. Let me come to the third concept of the, or rather, the concept of caste. It's a major issue. Caste, especially a structure of the society, is a basically basic organization of society around caste, and therefore this has remained with South Asian Christianity very strongly. So much so, as many of you know, that Christian congregations are also divided along caste lines, and whether it's the election of bishop, appointment by bishop, pastors, everything, it is a root cause of many, many conflicts within Christianity. Therefore, Christianity appears as a divided house. Interestingly, when the missionaries criticized the caste, one of the points of criticism of they said, you are in a glass house, you are throwing stone from a glass house. Within Christianity, there is a deeply caste division. Of course, you can illustrate it with very, very many examples, which I don't go into it. Then interestingly, the location of, the social location of the Christians is, I try to reflect on this, is in a caste society, you can think only in terms of the frame of the caste. Why do the Christians come within the frame of the caste is that you have, what do you call, there is a caste called Shudra, the service caste, serving caste. So Christians are the Shudra in the caste of the, you have to serve. If you are doing service or running a medical college, yes, it is, you have to do it because you are a Christian. It's your dharma. So that is precisely what Cardinal was also saying, the other day, saying that from this self-understanding of Christianity or service, that you universalize it, that it becomes the obligation of every human being, everyone. This is a big challenge which South Asian Christianity is facing, because it has been doing through the institutional phase of 150 years, through its many institutional, schools, colleges, etc., etc. But how do you make it something much larger? Then let me come to the fourth issue of the nationalism, which is also a much debated question, the role of, starting from history, what has been the role of Christians in the nationalism. It's also very ambiguous. There were Christians who sided, because you see, a colonial regime could not continue without the support of the elites. Everywhere the same. Therefore, the elites did not belong only to the Christians. Everybody, the Hindus. I heard that more in a later vein, that when the Second World War, when there was the danger of the Germans occupying, India and defeating the British, the Brahmins sent their children to learn German to Pune, so that they are ready when the next ruler comes. They are ready and then hold their position. So this whole accusation of guilt by association, the rulers, it's a very problematic and questionable. Uma Chakravarti has very beautifully questioned that. This in the introduction to Pandita Ramabai's book, story, very beautifully, this association, which is a question of, it's not any kind of chauvinism or anything, but needs to be questioned, this association of nationalism, etc. There were difference of opinions regarding this. There were also Christians who involved in the national, struggle for independence, etc. Immediately after the independence, what happened was the character of nation building development became more important. But today things have changed, and we are in a world of globalization, neoliberalism, capitalism. Therefore, we need to move in South Asia from the discourse of development, nation development of the nation building and development. This characterize the Christian discourse in relation to the society. Let me come to the fifth concept of the minority, around which there are so many debates, because it became major issue in the Constitutional Assembly, etc. Therefore, how do you form your identity, protect your identity? Is it the major issue, or being with the others? This is another problematic of Asian Christianity. Do you want to protect your identity? Therefore, we want to have some privileges, we want to have separate electorate, etc. But then the Christians who are part of the Constitution, the Assembly said, we want to be part of everybody's, therefore we give up the claim to have separate electorates, etc. But today it has come, with radical nationalism, right wing. Again, whether we should protect ourselves, is it the major issue when there is so much attacks against Christians? So, or should we, in spite of it, go for, something common and work with others? And let me come to the last question of the modernity, which is again a very problematic issue. Of course, it's very different in Japan under Meiji Restoration and China, now after the Cultural Revolution. The Christianity is seen as gateway to modernity and science and, all that, But when you read the history of China and India, for example, Christianity, it's almost identical. The same kind of reaction to colonial powers regarding Christianity is almost the same. But then today, the China has changed. There is so-called cultural Christian, there was Christian fever, etc. But India has not changed. There is nothing of that, Because this concept of the Christianity as gateway to modernity has not come in India, except among the people of tribals and the Dalit people, who see Christianity as the bearer of modernity for them, of education, women, all those things. Therefore, here is also another problematic of how do you relate Christianity and modernity in relation to the national questions. These are some of the issues. I think I should stop before being stopped. Thank you very much.
Felix, we hear now from Dr. Evers.
Morning to everyone. My theme is Southeast Asia. The term Southeast Asia is somewhat arbitrary, respectively geographically determined a common denominator of a host of countries with very different religious, cultural and ideological characteristics, but at the same time common features. Geographically, Southeast Asia comprises the countries of Myanmar or Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines, and East Timor. Historically speaking, there is the legacy of the cultural and religious influence of the two neighboring, culturally and religiously dominant areas of India and China. Indian influence in the form of the Hindu and Buddhist traditions can be found, for instance, in Indonesia, where the relics of the big temple areas of the Hindu Prambanan temple complex and the Buddhist temple area of Borobudur witness to the strong impact Indian cultural and religious traditions have left in the region. On the island of Bali, the Hindu tradition is still alive today. As regards the Chinese influence, Confucian ethical and cultural ideas were brought into the area by Chinese merchants and are still influential, for instance, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and the Philippines. Today, the religious situation of the countries in Southeast Asia is characterized by its diversity, because we find all major religions with more or less numerous adherents in all of them. And at the same time, there are countries where only one religion is tantamount and dominant. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Islam is a dominant religion. In the case of Malaysia, the national identity is determined by Islam in such a way that to be recognized as a genuine Malay or a Bumiputra, a son of the soil, one has to be a Muslim. In Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country in the world, the Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucian minorities are officially recognized, but experience again and again discrimination and harassment by the Muslim majority. In the province of Aceh, in the north of the island of Sumatra, where Muslims comprise 98% of the population, Muslim Sharia law has been introduced, which makes life difficult for the other religious minorities. In Thailand, Buddhism of the Theravada school, which comprises 95% of the population, is by far the numerically strongest religion in the country. Similar to the case of Malaysia, in Thailand too, to be a genuine Thai is consonant with being a Buddhist. The adherents of the other religious minorities of Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in Thailand rarely are Thai, but belong to other ethnic groups or are the descendants of immigrants from China, Vietnam, or the sub-Indian continent. The Philippines are the only country in Southeast Asia where Christianity, with a membership of 90% of the population, is by far the strongest religion. East Timor, the long-time Portuguese colony with a percentage of Christians as high as 85% of the population, is a special case, where the exceptional growth of Christianity came in response to the Indonesian occupation. Singapore, with a percentage of Christians of about 17%, and Vietnam, with a Christian population of 8.5%, are the other countries in Southeast Asia with a sizable Christian population. In all other countries in the region, Christianity is a small minority. As in the cases of Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar, the Christian population consists mainly of members of immigrants or ethnic minorities, a factor which is responsible for the fact that Christianity is considered to be a foreign religion. The political and ideological situation in Southeast Asia, too, is characterized by a great variety. All countries in the region, with the only exception of Thailand, have been under European colonial rule for more or less long periods till the end of World War II or the Pacific War in 1945. The borders and the territory of the newly independent states in Southeast Asia were shaped by this colonial past. Today, Thailand is a constitutional monarchy with a king as head of state. Due to the military coup d'etat in May of 2014, a military government was introduced and the constitution temporarily disbanded. Somewhat unique is the case of Brunei, with an absolute monarchy with the Sultan of Brunei as both head of state and head of government. Vietnam and Laos are both socialist countries with a single-party system led by the Communist Party. Myanmar was ruled for many years by a military junta which was responsible for a host of violations of human rights. In 2010, general elections were held for the first time after 20 years, which led to a civilian government which introduced some democratic reforms, hopefully leading to a full democratic system. Indonesia has experienced a long period of military rule, but has developed into a functioning democratic state, as the general election held this year proved. The Philippines have been under a military dictatorship for many years, which came to an end by the Rosary Revolution in 1987. The hopes that with the new constitution a truly democratic reform would be introduced have been thwarted, because till today the evils of corruption and extrajudicial killings have not been eliminated. Christianity's contribution to nation building and force of modernization. The extent of the Christian participation in and contribution to the process of nation building in the countries of Southeast Asia differs from country to country. In spite of the legacy Christianity has inherited by its connection with the colonial masters, Christians participated in the struggle for independence, for instance in Indonesia, where some Christians were among the leading resistance fighters against the Dutch colonial forces. In the first governments of the newly founded Republic of Indonesia, the number of Christian ministers was considerably higher than the numerical strength would have warranted. In the Philippines too, Catholic clergy and laity were leading the struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule. In the process of modernization in the countries of Southeast Asia, Christianity often has played the role of being an agent of modernization in the fields of national science, technology, industry, medicine, communication, education, literacy, in raising the status of women and the respect for human rights. The various activities of Christian missionaries in the field of social activities brought relief to many poor and marginalized people. The strongest contribution by Christian ideas and activities has been in the field of education. Even if one has to admit that the educational facilities were meant in the first place to be means of missionary outreach, they were at the same time instruments to prepare the ground for changes in the traditional societies. My last point, challenges for Christianity in Southeast Asia. In the last decades, Catholic and Protestant main churches have changed their attitudes towards the other religions in Southeast Asia from considering these religions mainly to be obstacles or even enemies, towards approaching them in dialogue and readiness for cooperation in the field of human development. These developments were accompanied by new insights into the theology of religion and interreligious dialogue, from considering these traditions to be the traditions of their own ancestors, to constitute part of their own heritage, and therefore to be able to serve as resource for developing new ways into an Asian inculturated theology. A good example of engaging into interreligious dialogue is the Silsila dialogue movement in Zamboanga in the Philippines, which is, in its various educational and social activities, has developed a unique spirituality of dialogue. Besides Silsila, there are many activities of Christian churches to engage into dialogue with their Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucian partners, with inclusion of members of traditional religions and cosmic religiosity in Southeast Asia. In recent years, however, the growth of radical tendencies in some of the religious traditions has hampered the efforts to foster a peaceful and harmonious living together of members of different faiths in the multi-religious and multicultural countries of Southeast Asia. In Indonesia, groups of militants who have become adherents of the radical ideas of Al-Qaeda and the Wahhabite or Salafist movements have been engaged in attacks against Christians, institutions, and persons. Also in the Philippines, the relationship between Christians and Muslims in Jolo and Pasilan in Mindanao have deteriorated due to the terror of the radical Islamist group of Abu Sayyaf. In Southeast Asia, Christianity is a minority religion, consisting of communities belonging to different ethnic groups, which as immigrants or descendants of immigrants often do not belong to the indigenous population. Christians, therefore, are often considered by the compatriots to adhere to a foreign religion imported from the West. The efforts by the Christian churches to become indigenous in their way of living their faith and expressing it in the liturgies and theology slowly are changing this image of the Christian churches. It is up to Christians in Southeast Asia to deepen the cooperation with members of other religions and ideologies to become accepted as equal partners in the work for a better and peaceful living together in harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really overwhelming presentation of the different characteristics of Christianity in Asia. And I guess when we think of the title of the book, Handbook of Asian Christianity, I guess it's easy to think of it as something that we all also grew up with. You know, we're full of these images of Christianity from birth, for example, as Julius shared yesterday. But when we hear all these sharings about Christianity in different parts of the world, it seems that what we grew up with and what we are used to are so far from reality. And Christianity, in the way that it has been discussed here, has shown that it's such an ambiguous concept and a contested concept. Something that is true in one part of the world or even one part of Asia is so different from another part of Asia. It has given identity to the Dalits, for example, who had converted, but at the same time it has also been a tool of persecution in another part of Asia. And so with all these various ramifications and descriptions of how Christianity has been, is there still a space for its liberative track or a liberative way so that it can help transform those who are really persecuted, those who are really in the margins of society?